almost walked past her. That was the part he could never quite let go of, even years later. The fact that he had almost kept walking. The fact that if the wind had been different that morning, if the canopy had been thicker, and if the sound had carried just slightly to the left instead of the right, he would have passed within 40 meters of her and never known she was there. He thought about this more than was strictly useful. He was aware that it was not a productive line of thought. What had happened, the wind had been what it was, and reconstructing the version of the morning where he had kept walking served no purpose. But the mind returns to certain things regardless of whether they serve a purpose, and this was one of them. The thing he kept returning to was not the finding, and it was the almost not finding, the narrowness of it. 40 meters in a jungle that covered a continent, one morning out of 213, a sound that carried on a wind that could have gone in any direction. He had spent 11 years doing fieldwork. He had learned in 11 years that the data you didn't collect was the most important data. You would never know about the thing you walked past, the sample you didn't take, the site you marked for follow-up, and then weather closed in and you never got back, and the gap in the record that you couldn't see because it looked exactly like the absence of a gap. He had almost walked past her, but the wind was what it was, and he heard her. Researcher Cale Dorn had been documenting the flora of Vertici for 7 months. It was slow and solitary work, the kind of field work that suited him precisely because it required nothing but attention and patience, two things he had in considerable supply. Vertis 5 was a Class 3 jungle world officially uninhabited and rich in biological data that the Coalition's Environmental Science Division had been cataloging for 11 years. Cale's assignment covered the Eastern Ridge sector, an area roughly the size of a small continent, full of things that had never been named and processes that had never been observed, and he had a routine. He left the base shelter at 0600 every morning, survey pack loaded, route planned the evening before. He moved through the canopy at a pace that allowed for observation, not fast, never fast, and because fast was how you missed things, and he cataloged what he found and marked what needed follow-up and returned before dark. 7 months of this had produced 11 survey journals and a dataset that his department coordinator described, in her last quarterly review, and as the most thorough Eastern Ridge documentation in the program's history. He was 3 hours into his morning survey when he heard something that didn't belong, not a predator. Not the wind, something smaller than either and more urgent, and coming from the base of a collapsed tree roughly 30 meters off his planned route. He almost didn't investigate. The survey had a schedule. Deviations added up. He had learned in 7 months of fieldwork that the Eastern Ridge rewarded consistency more than spontaneity, and that the things worth finding were usually on the route you planned and not the one you improvised. He investigated anyway. He could not afterward explain why. He had simply heard the sound and turned toward it, the way you turn toward certain sounds without deciding to. What he found, and wedged between 2 roots at the base of the fallen tree, wrapped in material he didn't recognize and couldn't immediately identify, was a living creature approximately the size of his forearm, pink-skinned, nearly hairless, and producing a sound that his translator didn't process because it wasn't language, just pure, unfiltered distress, broadcast at a volume that seemed impossible for something so small. Cale had spent 11 years studying biology across 14 planets. He knew what he was looking at, and he had read the Coalition's documentation on the species. He had seen photographs. He had never seen one in person. He had certainly never expected to see one here. He stood there for a long moment, rain beginning to fall through the canopy above him, and looked at the human infant looking back at him. And she had stopped crying momentarily at his appearance. Her eyes dark, unfocused, the eyes of something very young, were fixed on his face with the complete attention of a creature that had not yet learned what to be afraid of. Then she reached up, not toward anything specific, just up, in the instinctive reach of something small that needed to be held. Cale looked at that reaching hand for 3 seconds, then he picked her up. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to know where this story is reaching tonight, and if you are not subscribed to HFY Universe yet, do it right now, because what happens next is not something you want to stop halfway through. The first problem was warmth. The material she was wrapped in was doing some work, but not enough. Her skin was cold at the edges, and the rain was getting heavier. Cale had a thermal layer in his survey pack designed for his own biology, not hers, but biology was biology at the basic level and warmth was warmth. He wrapped her in it, held her against his chest where his own body heat could do something useful, and stood under the canopy to think clearly about what he was doing. The correct procedure was obvious. Contact the Coalition Research Station. Report the find. Wait for extraction. A human infant on Vertici was not a cataloging question. It was an emergency signal situation, and the kind of thing that triggered response protocols at multiple levels simultaneously. There was no ambiguity about what the correct next step was. He sent the contact signal. The response came back in 40 minutes, which was fast for the Eastern Ridge sector where signal routing was complicated by the canopy density. The station's response was clear. They would dispatch an extraction team. estimated arrival at his coordinates was 11 hours. He was to stay in place, keep the infant stable if possible, and document everything. 11 hours. Cale looked at the infant in his arms. She had stopped crying. She was warm now, pressed against him, and she was doing something he found difficult to categorize. She was looking at his face with an intensity that didn't match anything in his understanding of how young creatures typically behaved. Not frightened, not passive, looking. He sat down with his back against the fallen tree and held her and waited. The 11 hours passed. During them, he did what he always did when he was waiting. He paid attention. He noticed that she responded to sound, turning her head toward anything new, and he noticed that she was calmer when he was moving slightly than when he was completely still, which suggested she was accustomed to being carried. He noticed that she was hungry, which he couldn't address, and that she communicated this with a specific escalating sequence that started with small sounds and ended with the full distress call he had first heard from 30 meters away. He learned in those 11 hours that the distress call had 3 distinct stages, and he learned which one meant she was about to stop if he adjusted his position, and which one meant nothing was going to help until the underlying problem was solved. He learned that she slept in intervals, short ones, 15 to 20 minutes, then awake again, then back to the sequence of sounds, and he timed them without meaning to. By the 6th hour he had a reliable sense of the rhythm without looking at his survey instrument. He learned that the jungle at night sounded different when you were sitting still in it instead of moving through it on a survey route. Not worse, just different, more present. And he had spent 7 months walking through this canopy without once sitting in it after dark, and there was information in the stillness that the movement had been covering. He thought, at some point in the 8th hour, that this was probably the most useful data he had gathered in 7 months of fieldwork, and then recognized that thought as not being about fieldwork at all and set it aside. She slept against his chest for a long stretch in the 9th and 10th hours. He did not sleep, and he watched the canopy and listened to the jungle and counted the minutes and did not put any of it in his survey notes because none of it belonged there. He was going to file this in his survey notes. Then he realized that was not where it belonged and filed it somewhere else instead, and the extraction team arrived at hour 12, not 11. Weather delay in the northern corridor. They were professional and efficient: a medical officer, 2 logistics staff, and a coalition welfare coordinator named Saven who handled the documentation. They checked the infant, confirmed she was stable and warmer than expected given the conditions, and began the process of transferring her to coalition care. Saven asked Cale what had happened. He told her. She asked if he had found anything else at the site, any indication of how the infant had come to be there, any wreckage, any other survivors, and he said he hadn't looked yet, that he had stayed with her as instructed. Saven noted this in her documentation. The medical officer handed Cale back his thermal layer. The infant, now in a proper medical warming unit, had started crying again with the 2nd stage distress call, and Cale heard it and identified it correctly and kept his hands at his sides. The transfer was complete in 20 minutes. Cale watched the extraction team move back through the canopy with the warming unit, following the route they had come in on, and until the jungle had absorbed the sound of their movement and everything was quiet again. He stood at the site for a few minutes after they left. The fallen tree was still there, the roots still visible where she had been wedged between them, and the thermal layer he had wrapped her in was gone with the medical officer. There was nothing left at the site to indicate that anything had happened here except a flattened area in the undergrowth where he had sat for 11 hours. He took a photograph with his survey instrument, and not for the incident report. Saven had taken documentation photographs. For the survey record, Grid 774, collapsed tree, root formation, ground-level habitat characteristics. Standard documentation. He looked at the photograph after he took it, and then he put the instrument away and picked up his survey pack. Then he picked up his survey equipment and went back to work. He filed a standard incident report that evening. Found non-cataloged species individual correction, not non-cataloged, and found coalition member species individual in distress at grid coordinates 774 Cale. Approximate age per coalition developmental documentation 4 to 8 weeks. Stable at time of transfer. No other survivors or wreckage identified at discovery site. Full site survey pending. And he read the report before submitting it. Added one line. Circumstances of infant's presence on Verdus Ive unknown. Coalition Welfare Division notified. Survey of surrounding sector recommended. He submitted it and went to sleep. He did not sleep well, and that was also in a category he didn't have a name for yet. The investigation that followed the discovery took 3 months. Coalition Welfare Division coordinated with Coalition Intelligence and the Human Diaspora Registry, which was the body responsible for tracking human settlements in the Outer Reach. And Verdus Ive had not been a registered settlement, which meant either the infant's family had been there unofficially, which happened in the Outer Reach, frequently, or the infant had been transported to the planet from somewhere else, which raised questions nobody wanted to ask too directly, and the crash site was found in month 2. 40 kilometers from Cale's discovery coordinates, deep in a valley that the survey drones had difficulty accessing because of the canopy density, a small personal transport vessel, single-family unit based on the registration data that was eventually recovered, and 2 adults. 1 infant. The adults had not survived the crash, the infant had. Not because of anything she had done. She was 6 weeks old, she had done nothing except exist and cry. But the crash had been partially absorbed by the canopy, the forward section of the transport had remained largely intact, and she had been in the forward section, secured in the way that people who travel with infants secure them. She had been there for approximately 3 days before Cale found her. 3 days in a Class 3 jungle, alone. The medical officer's report noted that her survival for that period, given the temperature variance and the local fauna, was statistically unlikely. Cale read this part of the investigation report when it was shared with researchers in the Eastern Ridge sector for survey planning purposes. He read it once and then set it down and did not pick it up again. And he knew what the canopy sounded like at night. He knew what lived in the undergrowth. He did not need the statistical analysis to understand what 3 days on Vertiza 4 meant for something that size. He thought about the 40 kilometers between the crash site and where he had found her, and he thought about the sound that had made him change his route. He thought about the angle of the wind that morning and what would have happened if it had been different. He did not write any of this in his survey notes. Some things did not belong in the record. Some things you just carried, and he went back to his survey. The Welfare Division contact came 8 months after the discovery. Standard follow-up, they said they were notifying all individuals involved in the incident of the case outcome. The infant had been transferred to coalition foster placement in a human family in the mid-reach settlements and was, per the most recent welfare check, doing well, healthy, developing normally, no lasting effects from the exposure period. The welfare coordinator who sent the message not savin', a different one, asked if Cale had any questions about the case outcome, and he sat with the message for a long time before responding. He had been sitting with a lot of things for 8 months without quite knowing what to do with them. The survey journals for the period after the discovery were thorough and accurate, as they always were. They did not reflect the fact that he, at some point in the second month, started taking a longer route to the 774 grid sector without recording the reason for the deviation. The longer route passed the site where he had found her. He had not gone to the site specifically. He had simply walked near it, and the way you walk near something you are not ready to approach directly. He sent the coordinator one question. The response came 3 days later. It contained a single piece of information, shared with his consent, documented in the case file, her name. The name the foster family had given her, and because she had arrived without documentation of a given name, just the family name from the transport registry. He read the name once, read it again, saved the message in a folder he had created specifically for the incident documentation, which contained the incident report, the investigation summary, and the crash site findings, and now this. He went back to his survey notes. In the section covering grid 774, there was an entry that read, Non-standard sound event, origin investigated, infant human female discovered in distress, transferred to coalition care after 12 hours. Stable at transfer, responded to sound. 3-stage distress communication observed. Underneath, in a section that was not standard survey notation and that he had added the evening after the transfer and never removed, reached up, no reason, just up. He left it there. It belonged with the data, and 3 years later Cale was reassigned to a research station in the mid-reach sector, closer to settlements, more people than he was accustomed to. A different kind of work. The reassignment had not been his request. His department coordinator had suggested it, and noting that 11 years of solo fieldwork was an unusually long run and that the mid-reach station would benefit from his documentation experience. He had agreed because the coordinator was right, and because he had found, in the 3 years since Vertiza 4, that the Eastern Ridge sector felt different than it had before. Not worse, just different. More present, the way the jungle had felt during those 11 hours. He had not known how to explain this to anyone, so he had not tried. On his second week at the new station, he passed a Welfare Division notice board in the common area. Standard notices, foster placement updates, community resources, regional coalition news. He almost walked past it. He stopped. There was a photograph. A small girl, dark eyes, sitting in a garden somewhere green and ordinary, and looking at something outside the frame with the complete focused attention of a creature that had not yet decided what to be afraid of. He stood there for a long moment. The common area moved around him, colleagues passing, conversations at the edges of his awareness, and the ordinary noise of a station that was always full of people. He did not hear any of it. He was looking at her eyes. She was 4 years old in the photograph, maybe close to 5. The dark eyes that had looked up at him from between 2 roots on a rainy morning, unfocused then, were focused now, and fixed on something outside the frame with exactly the quality of attention he recognized, the same attention. Just older. He stood there until someone walked past close enough to break the moment, and then he stepped back and continued to his office. He walked a slightly different route back to his office after that, past the notice board for the rest of his time at that station. Not stopping. Just passing, just close enough to see that she was still there, still looking at things with that attention, still reaching, in her own way, and toward whatever was outside the frame. He never told anyone about the route change. It did not belong in any report. It was just something he did, the way you do things that don't have a category but that feel, without any particular logic, exactly right. That is the story for today, and I want you to drop a comment and tell me something, not just your city this time, though tell me that too. Tell me what you think Kale felt in that moment when she reached up. Because I think about that reach a lot. I think it is one of the smallest things that has ever happened and one of the largest. If this story stayed with you, share it with one person tonight. Just one. It takes 2 seconds and it means more to this channel than you know to HY Universe if you haven't already. New stories every week. The next one is already come. Until then, stay human. Even when you are not one, and especially then.